Begin with the sitting president of the United States asking a foreign country to target his domestic rival. In 2016, President Trump was then a candidate, and he did that, as everyone now remembers, with Russia. This year, as president, he secretly did it with Ukraine. And today, right in the middle of some of the most serious pushback that Donald Trump has ever faced in office, this full-blown impeachment probe into his attempt to collude with Ukraine to go after Biden, the president publicly asked China to go after Biden.
I have a lot of options on China, but if they don't do what we want, we have tremendous power. By the way, likewise, China should start an investigation into the Bidens, because what happened in China is just about as bad as what happened with Ukraine. I haven't, but it's certainly something we can start thinking about.
Lordy, I hope there are tapes. Well, there is one. You just saw it. Before I go any further, let's pause, as we sometimes do around here, and put what you just saw on your screen, that incriminating request from the president, in context. Until last week, Donald Trump tried to hide these kind of collusion requests. His administration tried to bury a whistleblower complaint about one. Then they fought releasing a transcript. Then they backtracked under an escalated impeachment probe and coughed up the incriminating collusion evidence. And that was a turning point. On this broadcast, we reported that shift from no collusion to pro-collusion in the Trump message machine. So what you're seeing today, which is obviously incriminating, which is something no president has ever publicly admitted to doing in office, is part of that shift. It continues right now. Donald Trump, having lost that battle to deny and hide collusion, is now doubling down on one of his other ploys. If you watch the news, you are familiar with some of his ploys. Revealing bad conduct in public to imply that something which is clearly substantively egregious must maybe somehow not look that bad if you just admit it and keep doing it. A kind of laundering. What you see here in your own eyes, if it feels like a trick, that's because it is. And that informs why he made another confession today, again, on this same collusion conduct that he was, remember, hiding and denying last week. In fact, last week was a period of time when the United States government had broken federal law to hide a whistleblower's complaint of collusion about Ukraine. So keep that in mind as you witness, because we can make sense of all of this, as you witness the president taking that which he was hiding last week and confessing on this effort to abuse his power.
Mr. President, what exactly did you hope Zelensky would do about the Bidens after your phone call? Exactly.
Well, I would think that if they were honest about it, they'd start a major investigation into the Bidens. It's a very simple answer.
Very simple answer. We're living through a test of our Constitution, and the president's making it clear on the Ukraine matter, which you just heard that confession on, there's nothing left to investigate. He asked foreigners to take out his rivals so he doesn't have to win re-election fair and square. And, you know, on news days like this, and this is really one, I didn't wake up this morning knowing the president would ask another country to collude and confess to the heart of the abuse of power alleged in the Ukraine scandal that's powering impeachment. So on days like this, a lot of us, frankly, we watch and we report and we work, but then we kind of wait to see how Rachel Maddow will put it all in context in the evening. If you're like me, maybe you do that sometimes. But I can tell you she was actually out on air earlier than usual today. So I have for you right now her early interpretation of the China confession and Trump's strategy.
The president walked out onto the South Lawn today, was asked, what did you want from Ukraine? And he said they ought to investigate Biden. And so I think his theory here is, you know, you get caught, you know, murdering somebody and your defense is, yeah, I killed the guy and he needed to be killed. And so what? I mean, doing it in public makes it less of a scandal. I don't know. But they don't really need an inquiry anymore. If they're going to go after him and impeach him for asking Ukraine to investigate Biden, he just announced that was what he did on the South Lawn.
He just announced it. I will be joined momentarily by the woman you see on your screen, Congresswoman Jackie Speier, live from Capitol Hill, where we'll see how this is playing there. But I want to begin with some analysis from a former federal prosecutor, Bear Berger, and Mark Ginsburg, who was U.S. Ambassador to Morocco and served as a presidential advisor on Middle Eastern issues. Good evening to you both. Ambassador, what does it mean when the president openly calls for this kind of foreign collusion and admits that which he was denying last week?
Well, he's trying to regularize what essentially is illegal conduct or conduct that is subject to an impeachable probe. I mean, this is the ploy that Donald Trump is engaged in. And what's more importantly behind all this, the fact that he's included China. You have to go back now and examine the law firm of Giuliani, Barr, and Pompeo. The three of these guys have been traveling around the world allegedly doing the president's bidding to investigate both 2016 as well as prospectively Joe Biden's son. And at the State Department, it's clear that there must be digital footprints over where Joe Biden's son Hunter traveled and what both Barr as well as Giuliani and as well as Pompeo's staff may be doing to support the president's assertion, well, let's have China investigate. Next thing, it'll be Italy. You know, I served as White House liaison for the State Department, and there's a political operation under Pompeo that deserves to be called out here and investigated whether they were involved in tracking Biden as well.
Briefly, if Pompeo is in on all of this, can he continue to serve as Secretary of State?
Listen, if he was on that call and the House of Representatives in an investigation determines that that call should have had Mr. Pompeo and anyone else on a call the president out, it is quite clear to me that Mr. Pompeo has, shall we say, joined the law firm of Giuliani and Pompeo rather than served independently as a Secretary of State.
Stay with me. I want you to bear it here in New York. If you woke up today and were busy and now you're looking at the news and you see under fire for Ukraine collusion, the banner on your screen, the president is seeking China collusion, to go after Joe Biden again, to double down on this. When you look at this legally, although an impeachment probe is not ultimately about resolving a defined felony, but legally, how would you look at a defendant acting this way?
Well, if I saw a defendant acting this way, I would see it as a pattern. I mean, what you have here is just more evidence of what he was trying to do with the Ukraine. It makes it very difficult to mount an offensive, that's not what I was trying to do, when he came out so publicly and did it today. I mean, whether it's legal or not, we sort of have to put that aside. It's almost certainly not constitutional. And exactly as Rachel said, this is one of those articles of impeachment that's not going to need an extensive inquiry. There's a tape. You play the tape, you have the article of impeachment right there. It's pretty cut and dry, whereas perhaps with the Ukraine scandal, it may not be quite as cut and dry.
Here's what Congressman Schiff said about all this. Take a listen.
I find once again the president inviting another country to interfere in our presidential elections repugnant and a fundamental breach of his oath of office.
Pretty emphatic. Rachel laid it out. You mentioned that. I want to ask you something that lawyers like yourself do know a lot about, and that's the timeline, the calendar, what normal people call delaying and what lawyers sometimes call dilatory tactics. Very annoying phrase, as you know. Lawyers like to buy time. The House is using a quasi-legal strategy here. Is Donald Trump sort of trying to call their delay or their timeline out here while they're on recess and daring them to proceed? Because part of what he seems to have done today is make a calculated risk. It's a risk, but a risk of saying, I tried hiding it. Now I'm doubling down on it. He may keep doing that for 2 weeks. See, there could be a list of 10 countries by the time the Congress gets back. And does that, in his mind, help normalize this in public opinion?
Well, I think it's certainly an effort to try to normalize this, to say, you know, I'm not trying to be covert about this. I'm not sneaking around trying to do this. I am so confident in my ability as the president to make this kind of a demand or a request to a foreign country that I am going to do it very publicly. So I think that's clearly, I don't know if we call it a strategy, but it's clearly an effort to do that. As far as the timing piece of this, I mean, I think that's the huge worry here, right? What does Congress actually do with something like this? Do they file it away and say exactly, you know, this will be one more article and we keep focusing on, you know, bringing in witnesses to talk about Ukraine? I mean, I think they sort of have to. I think they have some important witnesses that they haven't gotten to speak with. They have important evidence that they still want to get their hands on, such as all of the juicy evidence that is probably sitting there in Rudy Giuliani's phone right now. I think they have to proceed methodically with those requests, but they can't get bogged down in too much of those details. As we've said before, they have to be, laser focused here, get what they need to, and then move on to the next steps.
My panel stays. The other big story tonight that I want to update you on before we bring in the Congresswoman was this reporting on what lawmakers are actually learning from what Barrett was just talking about, the testimony in this impeachment probe. Donald Trump's former envoy to Ukraine, Kurt Volker. Now, he apparently warned Rudy Giuliani that he was getting untrustworthy information about Biden, according to the Washington Post. ABC News, meanwhile, suggests the top U.S. diplomat in Ukraine told others, quote, "I think it's crazy to withhold security assistance for help with a political campaign." Now, what does that mean? This is part of what Congress is learning. I want to tell you, we at NBC have not personally confirmed that reporting yet, but it does suggest that you had high-level U.S. officials who were inside the Trump administration who had formed a view, based on their assignments, on their orders, that Donald Trump was using the military aid to pressure Ukraine to go after Biden. That's another piece of this that in his first strategy, he's been denying.
There was absolutely no pressure put on him. There was no quid pro quo at all.
I want to bring in California Congresswoman Jackie Speier, who serves on the Intelligence and Oversight Committees. Thank you for joining us tonight. On this issue, what did Congress learn today?
So, Ari, I was not in the interview earlier today. I just arrived back in Washington, so I can't speak to it. I can speak to the fact that this is a very sober time, and we have a very solemn responsibility to pursue this impeachment inquiry. This is not a reality TV show, and unfortunately, that is what the president is attempting to play out here. Yes, I think his actions today create another article of impeachment. We've got to be reminding ourselves that China is one of our greatest adversaries, and he is negotiating a deal on tariffs with whether or not they come up with some dirt on Biden. So it doesn't take a lawyer to figure out that this is an effort by the president to once again normalize, as many of your other speakers have said, normalize something that is truly wrong.
So you're saying, let me ask you this, Congresswoman. You're saying this new request is an article of impeachment. Your colleagues, many of them are on record supporting Ukraine collusion as another article of impeachment. That's two. And as you know, many others have talked about the obstruction detailed in the Mueller report, even if you take the more conservative reading of just the 5 core incidents that were just defined as substantial evidence of obstruction by the president. That would be a third. Are you up to 3 and counting?
Well, I'm not going to count. I'm going to do what my job is, which is to interview all of the individuals that we are seeking information from, have all of the documents provided to us by Giuliani and others, and make the case, if there is a case to be made, that we should move forward with articles of impeachment. Let's remember what Mike Pence said in 2016. This is basic stuff. You do not solicit a foreign person or a foreign government to solicit them for campaign information. And that's precisely what President Trump has done in Ukraine and what he's seeking to do now with China.
So if all that is right, and you heard what our guests, I think, have said and what I played of Rachel Maddow and others, what else is Congress waiting for? I mean, is there now a case to be made to holding a floor vote on the articles of impeachment the week you all get back?
I think what we need to do is be both expeditious but also very thorough. And that's going to require us to interview a number of people. And frankly, as the president continues to mouth off as he does regularly, he may be making more articles for us on a daily basis. He would serve himself best if he would turn off his Twitter account and stop speaking about impeachment, because this is a serious effort that is underway, and we are not going to allow him to somehow diminish the nature of this inquiry.
Let me follow up on that and whip it around the panel as we're short on time. Does more time benefit Trump or not on the impeachment vote? It sounds like the Congresswoman thinks not and says to go thorough. Mark, what do you think?
Well, there's no doubt that going thorough means that not necessarily that you should necessarily go long. Adam Schiff is taking the lead on this. He's got a great staff. I think there's a danger here that the more this plays out, the more the president is able to sort of try to normalize this with Americans and to say that this is just exactly what he claimed it is, a witch hunt. And I think getting the panel to convince the American people that this is serious and not permit the president to regularize this means you've got to move quickly.
Barrett?
Yeah, I agree. I think that more time makes it almost seem that Congress needs more evidence, that they need, one more smoking gun, one more amazing witness that can add to this, when really they have the evidence now. They have the, tape, they have the transcript of the conversation with respect to Ukraine. So I think that the danger is if you go on too long, it makes it seem like they're not confident with the evidence they have.
Both persuasive arguments. Congresswoman, of course, I'm going to give you the last word. The difference between you and me and everyone else on the panel is you have a vote based on your victory and your constituents. But it does sound like this panel would argue that you should go quicker than you may have sounded and then the speaker sounded. I give you the final word.
Well, I will say that the American people deserve to have a full and comprehensive set of principles that they can look at. I don't think we're going to linger, but I do think that we're going to make sure that we don't leave any stone unturned. And that's our job.
Congresswoman Speier, thank you again. Barrett and Mark, appreciate it. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.